and so it is. Well, good morning, everyone, and thank you for being with us today. The theme, of course, is We Belong, and I would like to start with just a little bit of excerpts from Rumi, one of my favorite poets. And this is from a translation by Coleman Barks and John Moyne. It's about the Reed Flute. Listen to the story told by the reed of being separated. Since I was cut from the reed bed, I have made this crying sound. Anyone apart from someone he loves understands what I say. Anyone pulled from a source longs to go back. And it continues on, and I invite you to search for that later and read the whole poem. There's one more excerpt that I want to start with today, and we'll come back to Rumi by the end. And this one is titled, A Craftsman Pulled a Reed. A craftsman pulled a reed from the reed bed, cut holes in it, and called it a human being. Since then, it's been wailing a tender agony of parting, never mentioning the skill that gave it life as a flute. I invite you to consider the effect that poetry has on us, that music has on us, that the arts have on us. We spend a great deal of time thinking. We say we're in our heads, but we really don't know where thinking takes place. It seems to take place in the totality of our being. But the intellect has become the predominant aspect of our lives in the times in which we live. And it wasn't always that way, but it is now. The intellect dissects, it divides, it takes the whole and breaks it down into parts, and then analyzes each little part and tries to figure out about the whole. Deductive reasoning, we start with the effect and we try to work our way back to cause. But of course the divine doesn't work that way. The divine already is, the divine already knows. It works through inductive. It works, I may have those backwards, by the way, but it works from the beginning out. Poetry, music, the arts, they're more of what we would say come from the heart. There is an essence and a feeling that goes with them. We think of the lines by Rumi, of the reed flute. Since the day I have been cut from the reed bed, I've made this sound, this longing to return. And when I hear those words, I'm taken to the sound of the flute. We used to, in Wilmington there, Dan used to come and play his flute for us on Sundays, his Native American flute. There's something about that music, There's something about that flute that we can feel the wail in it. We can feel the longing. We can feel it kind of trailing off, And Rumi touches that. He touches that and he brings that to life for us. And he uses this example of the reed flute in several different poems. And in one he says that it is the breath of God. It is the breath of spirit that moves through the flute and makes the sound. And of course, you and I are the flute. We are the instrument that God plays. But as he said in that second poem, but we tend to get caught up in the lamenting and the wailing and the longing. And we forget about the one who made the flute in the first place. What we want to talk about today is to surrender to the feeling of longing, to surrender to surrender to that desire to belong, to return home, to go back to the reed bed, to be with the one who created us. And we want to get out of the head and into the heart and feel the music, feel the poetry, feel the presence of the divine. A few simple lines of a poem can take us to a place that it would take hours and days and weeks for the head to reach. Emmett Fox, in his commentary on Scripture, he says, you know, if you look at Bible verses, for example, it's amazing how we can take one little simple paragraph, sentence, and it so succinctly touches something that it takes preachers hours to discuss. But it's there in its essence because it's there in the language of the heart. Ernest Holmes said, when the divine speaks to us, the divine speaks in the language of the heart. But we don't always hear because we're listening for the language of the head. Let's open our hearts. Let's go into that feeling. Let's invite the experience, the conscious realization of the experience of the presence of pure, unconditional love, the presence of the divine. Let's invite that into our being. Let's open our hearts to receive. Let's get the head out of the way. Let's let love be love. In these few simple lines, Rumi strikes a chord, you know. And if you remember the commercials, is it live or is it Memorex? You know, they had Ella Fitzgerald would hit the note and the glass would shatter, and then they would play back the tape, and the fidelity of the tape was so good that the glass shattered from the recording. But this idea of resonance frequency, that everything in nature is attuned. It has a frequency at which it naturally would vibrate. And if we can find a way to excite that, to agitate that, by setting up a frequency, setting up something at the same exact frequency over here, this will start to vibrate over here. It's essentially how your microwave oven works. It gets the water molecules in the food to run around and bump into each other. It makes heat. So if you've ever played music, if you've ever been in a setting with several pieces, you know, piano and stringed instruments and wind instruments, there's a resonance that takes place that if one instrument hits a note and it's perfectly tuned to that other instrument, for example, you know, a piano will just start to vibrate. The note in the piano will start to vibrate when the other instrument is playing. There's something there that wants to receive. There's something there that wants to be excited. There's something there that wants to vibrate at that frequency. And it's ready, willing, and able when something touches it. And I think poetry does that. It does it for me anyway. Music does that. And what we want to do is find that. Find whatever it is that strikes that chord in your heart, that vibrates the excitement in your heart, that allows that joy to come forward. For it is in the joy that we are experiencing the presence of the divine. I've mentioned Vernon Howard before and his book Psychopictography, and if you can get a copy of that, please do. I don't know that it's in print anymore, but there's probably used copies around. And Vernon Howard was a unity minister in Atlanta, and he wrote this little book, and there's like 150 small stories, small parables in there. And the point of the book was that ancient teachers and modern teachers as well use parables because that story and the images that you and I create in the theater of our mind, when we hear that story, that stays with us long after the words are gone. That stays with us. So speaking of the divine as a good shepherd, taking care of its sheep, that had meaning to people who are familiar with that culture. It doesn't have a lot of meaning for us. We don't know much about raising sheep. Most of us living in the city. But for people who grew up in an environment where they understood the relationship between the shepherd and the sheep, which was a caring relationship, that example means something. Sowing seeds and getting a crop means something to people who live in a society that depends on farming. So Howard tried to give us more modern parables, more modern stories, that we could capture the essence of the teaching and take it with us. And the very first story in the book, it has stayed with me all these years. I probably read the book, I would say, 30 years ago. And this very first story just stays with me. And he started the book with this story for a reason. He was a very gifted writer. But he takes us back to Europe, several hundred years ago in Europe, when people traveled by horse and wagon. And there was a little boy, 4 or 5-year-old little boy, and he wandered away from his home, kind of like a warning story, but it's more. He wandered away from his home, and a wagon was passing by with some strangers in it, and they saw the little boy, and they thought they could use him, so they grabbed the little boy and they put him in the back of the wagon and they rode away. And they made this little boy kind of like their forced labor. They raised him, but they made him work. And he had to do all of the different tasks that these people wanted him to do. And he knew he didn't belong with them. So he knew that he didn't belong with them. And when he grew to be a young adult, teenager, he looked for his chance. And one night it came, they were all asleep, and he escaped. He just grabbed what little belongings he had and he started walking away from them. He didn't know where he was going, but he knew he didn't belong with them. He knew he belonged somewhere else. And he kept thinking and he kept walking. And the only thing that he could remember about the town that he grew up in was the sound of the church bell. As they were carrying him off in the wagon, he could hear that bell ringing, and that sound stayed with him. And he thought to himself, if he could just hear that bell one more time, he would know he was home. He would know he was back where he belonged. So he set out on foot on a journey. In every town he visited along the way, he stayed long enough to hear that bell, the church bell, and he would listen. But it didn't strike a chord within him. There was nothing familiar about it. So he kept moving. He kept wandering. He kept searching. And one day he was coming up a hill, and he couldn't see what was on the other side of the hill, but he could hear what was on the other side of the hill. As he was coming up the hill, he started to hear a church bell ringing. And he stopped, and he listened. And he heard it again. And it was familiar. It struck a chord. He felt this was it. His pace quickened. He ran up the hill, and when he got to the top of the hill, out of breath, he looked down into the valley, and the church bell was louder now. And his heart leapt with joy. This was it. He was home. He was back where he belonged. What Rumi is telling us with the Reed Flute, what Vernon Howard is telling us with the story of the little boy and the bell, is that we know that we belong. But we are trying to search, we are trying to find our way back to that experience that has left a memory of familiarity within us. And it is that longing that we must accept, that longing that we must surrender to, and that quest that we must commit to. Now, as I started out, I said, we have the intellect, which engages in thought, sometimes engages in too much thought, and analyzes and divides and tries to understand and tries to make sense of things. And in that process, it can actually divert us. It can actually lead us astray. Excuse me. Let me just get a tissue on my nose here. So what happens to us is we misunderstand the longing. We know that we are longing, but we're not certain what we are longing for. We are not certain where it is. But there's a longing within us. Now remember, when we talk about desires, I say, desire is kind of life's way of getting us to engage in something that is good for us. Our body needs water. We get a desire called thirst. We drink the water. That's good for us, you see. But whether we drink water or we drink something that's not good for us, that's up to us. That's a choice we make. And we don't always make it consciously. So sometimes we take what is a good longing, a good desire, and we go about trying to fulfill it in ways that are actually the opposite, or lead us into the opposite direction. So for example, we may go for a a can of soda that's loaded with sugar and salt. And we drink it down, in a little while we're even thirstier than we were before. So we try to fulfill a good longing, a good desire, but the way that we went about it was kind of counterproductive. Pema Chodron, in one of her essays, said something that stays with me. She said, we as human beings have this unique characteristic that we say we want to do one thing, and then we engage in a set of activities that bring us just the opposite. And her example was she was writing a book about peace and got stressed out trying to write this book about peace. So we have this longing, we have this desire, but we're not exactly certain what it is that we are longing for. We're not exactly certain what this desire is all about. And the intellect takes us on a journey of discovery, of trying all different things, of looking all different places, of engaging in many different activities. But they may or may not be activities that bring us home. So it would help us a little bit if we understand what we're longing for, why we were left in this condition of longing, and how to get back home, So if we look at world religions, we come across this theme of the fall of mankind. Now here in the West, the fall of mankind, the fall of humanity, is generally understood as a fall from a state of grace. That human beings, Adam and Eve, the examples in the book, human beings lived in this condition where they were in the presence of the divine, where they, excuse me, they were every wish was fulfilled. They had everything that they wanted. But then they did something that they shouldn't have done. And as punishment, they were cast out. They were cast out of the garden. And they were being punished. They had to suffer death. They had to bear their children in pain. They had to eat their bread with the sweat of their brow. They had to work hard and all these things. And in this understanding of the human condition, right? Now you have to imagine this. You can imagine a little kid saying, well, gee, Mommy and Daddy, if God is so good, why do we have to work so hard? Well, you see, there was a time when we didn't. But people didn't do as they were told. And now they have to suffer, Reminds me of the tales people used to tell us when we were kids, Yeah, well, they didn't do their homework, so that's the punishment they got. So we grow up then in this culture here, in this culture of separation, but the separation is as a punishment, right? And as in our discussion before we started this morning, we talk about accepting ourselves with our imperfections, not judging ourselves, not being ashamed, not suffering guilt, not sensing that we belong, this being ostracized, this being put out from the garden. And we're trying to work our way back, right? Remember, so in this biblical tale then, when Adam and Eve were put out of the garden, there were two cherubim stationed there, and they had swords and they had fire and they had all these things, and they were there to to prevent Adam and Eve from getting back into the garden. Excuse me while I get some water. Now we can take that story literally, or we can understand it as a parable. We can understand it as the story of the boy knowing that he belonged and trying to return back home. See, why would the cherubim be at the gate unless the desire unless the desire to return home was already there, you see. There's more going on to that story than what appears. We're supposed to return to the tree of life. We have to make our way back home. We have to find our way past these cherubim. Why would divine love create us, cast us out, and then put cherubim there to keep us from getting back in? Why? We have a similar image that comes to us from Buddhism. And the Buddha is sitting just inside the entrance of a cave, in deep meditation, cross-legged, lotus position, eyes almost closed. And he's holding out one hand with the palm facing outward, like a crossing guard holds out their hand to stop traffic. Stop. And just outside the entrance of the cave were these two ugly monsters with fires and swords. And they're frightening and they're terrifying. Same symbolism. Same symbolism. What does it mean? If we wish to reach the Buddha consciousness, we have to get past these two guards at the gate. But who would put two guards at the gate? Why would there be two guards at the gate? From the East, from ancient India, from ancient Hindu religions, we get a different concept of the fall. The fall is not a fall of humanity from a state of grace and as a result we are being punished. But the fall is more of a descent. It is the descent of pure consciousness, the divine, into matter. That divine consciousness desired to express itself in different ways and descended into they call it the coarser form of matter, from pure spirit. So if you think of steam and ice, pure spirit decided to express itself as life here on earth. And in so doing, the essence of what it is remains. But the awareness, the consciousness of what it is cloaked, is clouded, is not understood. And in this example of the fall then is the descent of pure consciousness into matter through which it cannot express completely. It is constricted by its own creation for its own purposes. But that essence of what it is caused that matter to evolve into different forms of life, up to and including this form of life, which is a form of life that is capable of awareness, capable of self-awareness, capable of remembering, capable of discovering that it belongs. It belongs to the one. It belongs to the unity. It belongs to God. Totally different view, right? Totally different picture of what's going on here. So we have this longing, we have this desire. There's something within us. Both views indicate that there is a return, a coming back home. In one, it is sneaking past the guards at the gate to get to the tree of life. In the example of the Buddha, it's getting past the two monsters at the entrance of the cave. And in the Hindu mystics' view, it is the human consciousness realizing that it is part of divine consciousness but more than just an activity of thought. It is a conscious realization of the experience of the presence of God. That is the longing. That is the desire. Remember, we're told, don't go looking for God if you're not looking as earnestly as you would look for a pond if your hair was on fire. This is a passion that develops within us as we grow spiritually. We have the aha, we have the awakening, you know. Christmas is coming up in a couple months, and we'll talk a little bit about the symbolism of that story. But this presence of the divine, this awareness of the presence of the divine comes into our lives as a baby. And we must nurture it. We must let it grow until it has its way, until it becomes our passion, until it becomes the object of our longing. So at some point then we say, well, you know, I've looked here and I've looked there and I've looked there and I've tried this and I've tried that and I've tried the other thing. We talked for the last month or so, we talked about pleasure versus happiness. And that if we find that which makes us happy and do more of it, and find that which makes us unhappy and do less of it, that's a good starting place, you see. That's a good place to begin. That is a good place to go. So if we recognize then that this longing, this crying out of the reed to be returned to the reed bed, this desire within us that causes us to seek everywhere, like the boy wandering around Europe, just going from town to town to town, not exactly sure what he was looking for, but he knew it was out there somewhere. He knew he had to keep looking for it. See, and if we go back to Joseph Campbell's works on the hero's journey, this is essentially the hero's journey. You and I are each the hero. You and I are each on this journey. The hero gets a call. The hero gets a call. This is when the journey begins. It says, there's something you ought to go do. And at first the hero says, no, not me. You got the wrong guy here. You must be talking to somebody else. But eventually the hero has to give in. The hero has to say, okay, I'll undertake that journey. And they do. And they go and they have all of these different experiences and they learn different things along the way and they experience things along the way. And when they return back to the starting place, what they typically realize is they're right where they were when they started, but they are changed people. They are different people. The experience is not about getting stuff. The journey is not about getting stuff. The journey is about undergoing the change. Undergoing the change. And what is this change then that we are undergoing? We are releasing and letting go of everything in our lives that is unlike divine love. That is unlike divine love. It's like the story of, that you've heard a zillion times about someone who went to the sculptor, and there was a big block of stone, and they said to him, what are you going to make? And he says, an angel. And they said, how are you going to do that? He says, I'm going to chip away everything that doesn't look like an angel. He saw the angel in the stone. That's what was calling to him. And he was going to remove everything unlike the angel. What we come to experience is that there is that beautiful presence within us. Where did we come from? Why are we here? Where are we going? In the intellectual concept of the divine, if we get the theologians together, and I love somebody put a quote up by Meister Eckhart last week. It said, theologians argue, mystics agree. If we go back and we consider this thing that we call God, remember this is why every first Sunday, every January, we go back to what is your concept of God? In our understanding of this thing called God, it is perfect unity, it is perfect oneness, it is perfect wholeness, it is all that there is. If we look at what the physicists tell us, we have something that's there before a Big Bang, but then it comes into expression in many different forms, from the great singularity to the great multiplicity, but each and every part of that multiplicity is some part of that singularity in expression. We are all the same stuff and substance. Each and every one of us is some part of the divine. We have been made in its image and likeness. We have been made out of its very stuff and substance. And we must recognize that we belong. We must realize that we belong. We must experience the belonging. It is already here. Remember as we said last week, there's no sense looking for it out there. It's already here. It is already within. This is what we are longing for. We are longing to belong. So how do we do that? How do we do that? Compassion. Love. See, the intellect tells us that everything is apart, and everything is separate, and everything is different. We come into this world and we try to find our tribe, our people, you know. This is us, and we're not like them, you see. We kind of grow up bewildered, you know, trying to figure out what is our place? Where do I fit in this family? Where do I fit in this society? We develop all sorts of ideas about what we are, what we're supposed to be, and, you know, our mother was this and our father was that, and we need to do this and we need to do that. We need to go to the school they went to, and all of these different things that we're trying to do just for a sense of belonging, just for a sense of identity, just for saying, this is my tribe. But as we grow spiritually, we come to recognize that everything and anything that separates us from others separates us from God, because it is all God. My biases, my prejudices, my opinions, all of these things are keeping us from the experience of some part of the divine. And it's easy for us to look out there and say, well, I don't like this about those people. I don't like that about those other people. They're not like us. But I just love the way that things work out, because at the very beginning, when the very conversation we had before this started, the quotes were about accepting ourselves. Accepting ourselves. You see, we cannot love completely another, whether it be a member of our family, whether it be our significant others, whether it be somebody in our community, whether it be somebody over there that we don't like, wherever over there is, until we truly love ourselves. Until we truly love ourselves. The two guards at the gate in both the story of Genesis and Buddha, they represent our fears and our desires. Not our desires for the good things, experiencing the divine, but the desires that lead us astray. And fear is a lack of love. Fear is a lack of love. So if we wish to go back into the garden, to the tree of life, to get back home where we belong, our work is an internal job. What are you afraid of? Where have you allowed your longing to be misdirected? To spend time looking for happiness out there, instead of in here. The New Testament gives us a wonderful parable about coming home, and it's the tale of the prodigal son. And just very briefly, this rich man had two sons. And in that culture and in that custom, when the father died, the estate got divided up or divvied up however the father wanted. The men owned all the property in those times. And this young man went to his father and he said, listen, I can't wait for you to die. I've got things to do, places to go, people to see. Why don't you just take whatever was going to be my share of your my inheritance, and just give it to me now, and I will go off. And then when you die, my brother can have the rest. And he did. He went off and he spent his money foolishly. He wound up living in a pig pen. And he couldn't even eat the food that was given to the pigs. And you have to remember, in a culture that abhorred eating swine, that's a representation of that's about as low as you can go. So he came unto his own. He came unto himself. He had a realization, I don't belong here. I belong back home. I'm going to go back home. So he did. And the story goes on that when the father saw him coming back home, he was so happy to see him that he ran out and greeted him. He fell on his neck, we are told. Right? He gave him a big hug and a kiss. Fell on his neck. And the son said, oh, I'm so terrible. I'm so bad. I did such terrible things. I didn't listen. I took your money. I went away. And the father acknowledged none of that. He said, you are home. You are my son. Let's celebrate. Let's celebrate. No guilt, no shame, just celebration. And there was another son. There was another son in the story. And he said, what is this? Think of rivalry and how rivalry keeps us from experiencing the unity. He said, what is this? I've been your good and faithful son. I didn't run off and drink and gamble and do all those things. And you never had a big party for me. And the father said, more or less, you never asked. You never asked. What I am inviting everyone to do today is to ask. To ask. Ask yourself to go into your heart, to experience the love that is there. Acknowledge your fears and let love dissolve them, for perfect love casts out fear. Acknowledge the longings that lead us astray. I'm not saying they're bad. I'm saying they just take us away from diversions, I guess would be the better word. Diversions. When we've been looking for love in all the wrong places, we've been spending time that now we want to spend at home with the beloved. Dr. Holmes tells us that with all of our studying, with all of our practice, there comes a time where all we want is to be at home with the beloved. That's what I'm talking about. Open your heart. Ask the divine love that is already there to make itself known. Ask yourself to accept it, releasing and letting go of any ideas of unworthiness, punishment, banishment. Recognize that the only The only banishment was a banishment in consciousness, because we thought we were separated. In this process of consciousness evolving into life forms with greater capability for consciousness, we didn't know. And we made up all kinds of stories. And now it's time to let those stories go. I want to close then with one more brief piece from Rumi. As you can tell, he touches my heart. This one is called Take Down a Musical Instrument. Today, like every other day, we wake up empty and frightened. Don't open the door to the study and begin reading. Take down a musical instrument. Let the beauty we love be what we do. I'm going to read that last line one more time. Let the beauty we love be what we do. What he's telling us is, don't lead with your head. Lead with your heart. Your heart knows how to love. Let all of our crazy ideas of the intellect get behind the heart. Take down your instrument. Play. Read poetry. Listen to music. Paint if you know how to paint. Walk in nature. Find that which speaks to your heart and devote yourself to it. Listen for that bell that is striking within you, calling your home. Think of the one who created the flute, for that's what the flute longs to return to. You are each and every one, we are each and every one, a beautiful expression of divine love. We are all on the hero's journey of discovering that and living that. Let today be the day. And so it is.